Hey, good morning, everybody. Meteorologist Jim Dickey here with another edition of Tropics Talk, of course, focusing in on Ian. We start with the 8 o'clock advisory, and I want to start things off just like yesterday. This is the 8 o'clock Sunday, September 25th advisory from the Hurricane Center. If you're watching this anytime after 11 o'clock on this Sunday morning, I want you to be sure you're checking back in with the National Hurricane Center to see the latest forecast, to see the latest stats, to see the latest cone of concern, because they'll be updating every 3 hours going forward from here. I want to make sure you have the latest data. I'm going to continue, with the broader discussion of the forecast, the models, where this will go, but I want you to be sure, too, that you have the latest from the National Hurricane Center as well, and base your decisions off of that forecast from the National Hurricane Center. So there is that 8 o'clock advisory, a 50-mile-per-hour tropical storm. Now, Ian has really struggled over the last 48 hours to really coalesce around one center of circulation. I think we're finally seeing that come together. Now, of note, on the satellite presentation, too, there's still some sort of pockets of clearing. You're not seeing that well-defined, what's called central dense overcast in the satellite, and we'll dive into that in just a second here. But we'll begin with sort of what is new and different. What has changed in the last 24 hours since the last time we talked here in Tropics Talk? At this point, I think it's pretty safe to say a direct landfall in southwest Florida appears fairly unlikely. I'm going to show you the cone of concern forecast from the Hurricane Center in just a bit. Basically, the southern half of southwest Florida is now out of that cone of concern, which again, remember, that cone is showing you the likely track of the center of the storm. It's given out in a cone to show you the uncertainty, and there still is uncertainty in the exact track of that center, but it does look now a little less likely that that center tracks over southwest Florida. Still, this is going to be a large and powerful hurricane as it nears us, or even passes us by well west in the Gulf of Mexico, and with that, we're still likely to see impacts. The cone does not show you the wide-reaching impacts from a tropical storm or hurricane, and in this case, impacts, potentially significant impacts, are still possible, with the worst weather likely occurring on Wednesday. So there's Ian right now as I'm recording this. The 8 o'clock advisory, 50-mile-per-hour winds moving to the west and northwest. Of note, the center point marked at 15 north latitude. I've been watching that 15 north latitude mark as sort of a threshold as I've looked at the models over the last couple of days. As we were going back earlier on to late last week, a number of the models that showed more of a track over South Florida, over Southwest Florida. At this point in the game, they had the center of Ian fairly close to Jamaica. This has definitely stayed on a more southerly track of what those models were showing going back a couple of days ago. So it's no surprise to see the sort of shift, as we'll look at in the models, where more of them are focused from Tampa northward through the Big Bend to the Panhandle as far as the most likely landfall location from this storm. And again, it's been a struggle to sort of find the center, the true center of Ian, although you can sort of see from this satellite presentation now, it's a little easier to pick this out, even from this satellite, where that center is. And the hurricane hunters are still flying around in the storm right now, as they will be throughout, to get all that data in, to ingest it into the models, to make sure we're getting the most reliable forecast models going forward. But as far as I can tell from the satellite presentation, it's all sort of coalescing on a center right around there. And you're starting to see, as I mark that center, the beginnings of the turn to the north. Also seeing some clear features going on of what appears to be an intensifying tropical storm. There's that pretty clear spiral band that you can track all the way out there, perhaps a second one forming up here. When you start to get those spiral bands, that's again the beginning of the coalescing of that deep convection, that deep upward motion, all that warm, moist ocean air lifting north, setting up over the center that you see in a tropical storm that's on the verge of intensifying, of becoming a hurricane. And I do think that is what is in the offing over the next 24 to 48 hours. Intensification with Ian. When you look at the wind shear, it has really died down. Now, note, we talked about this yesterday. See how there's sort of those winds going across Cuba out of the south and west? That's that upper level trough, that little dip in the jet stream. It's a very subtle little feature, and it is what is going to really help to kick this north over the next 24 hours. Perhaps bringing a little bit of shear into play in the near term. Perhaps part of the reason why it has struggled to sort of define that low-level center. But it's been fighting that high shear all along. That's another reason why there are so many little different areas of spin as the hurricane hunters are flying around in it yesterday. It has really been battling that shear, trying to define itself. Now, though, as it gets into the western Caribbean Sea, and especially the southeastern Gulf of Mexico, the shear is going to go away. It's basically going to be ideal or perfect upper-level conditions for intensification. And along with that, this is going to track right over an area of high ocean heat content, basically rocket fuel for a tropical storm or hurricane. There is going to be a whole lot of fuel for this to take from the ocean, and it, in all likelihood, will. When you look at the intensity forecasts, and this was from 6Z this morning, remember, each line is a different model forecast. Just about every one you look at has a quickly, if not rapidly, intensifying tropical storm, hurricane. You see, by 48 hours out, most of these models show a major hurricane. By 72 hours out, a good number of these models show a Category 4 hurricane. And so it's no surprise to see the National Hurricane Center going for a high-end major hurricane working into the Gulf of Mexico. I say no surprise, but in fact, it is somewhat of a surprise in that the National Hurricane Center is usually somewhat conservative with their intensity forecast. This is sort of historic, how quickly they show the intensification. It speaks to, in recent years, how so many storms have been able to go through this rapid intensification process in this general vicinity. We think back to last year. We had Ida do it. We think back to 2020. We had Laura do it. A number of storms went through rapid intensification in the very active 2020 hurricane season. The models aren't usually great about picking that up, but you see that signal in the models already picking it up. And so again, that is the forecast here. By 2 a.m. on Tuesday, a Category 2 hurricane, or Category 3 hurricane rather, 120 mile per hour winds, moving its way across the western end of Cuba, churning into the eastern Gulf of Mexico as a Category 4 hurricane by 2 a.m. Wednesday, and then making the turn toward likely in to Florida. Again, for our purposes, in southwest Florida, there has been a trend in the models showing instead of a landfall directly here in our area, as we were talking about a couple of days ago, more to the north. And so, when you look at the edge of the cone of concern forecast, from the Caloosahatchee on southward, we are now out of that cone. As you get closer in time, the cone gets more and more narrow. So I would not be surprised if by 11 o'clock and certainly by 5 o'clock, if just about all of southwest Florida is out of the cone. But remember, the center can track anywhere within the cone. That's what history tells us. So by 2 a.m. Thursday, could be anywhere from here to here, closer to us in southwest Florida. And generally speaking, the closer this comes, the worse the impacts will be for us in southwest Florida. In fact, you know, there's the two sort of major global models still at odds as to where this will go. And this close in, it's kind of odd to see such disagreement. I think it speaks to the fact that the storm has struggled to really define its center to this point. But now again, we're getting closer in time. We're getting that data coming in from the hurricane hunters. I suspect through the day today, we will see this difference between the GFS forecast model and the European forecast model lessen. We'll see these models come together much more closely. But still at this point, the European shows a landfall along the Florida Gulf Coast, somewhere near Bradenton, Tampa Bay, while the GFS stays about 250 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, those would have huge implications as far as what the impacts would be. So let's begin with the European forecast model, which, not to sugarcoat it in any way, shape, or form, would be a significant impact, not just for us here in southwest Florida, but a historic impact for the Tampa area in particular. As we go through this would be by 4 a.m. Wednesday. You see the wide rain field associated with Ian. And of note, to the north here, you see how there's this line of rainfall? There's going to be a stalled out front in play. So you have all that southerly wind, all that deep tropical moisture being lifted in on the eastern side of the circulation around Ian. It is going to hit that frontal boundary, and that's going to be a whole lot of that very high moisture content air sort of hitting a wall and being forced to go upward. And that's going to produce a whole lot of rainfall. So there's going to be a corridor here, I think, across central and northern Florida, potentially even towards this here in southwest Florida, of significant rain even before Ian moves its way in. But we continue through this model run, and you see what the European does. It brings the center in right around Sarasota, Bradenton, tracks it right up Tampa Bay, and then continues on to the north and east from there. And that would be a significant impact. I know, in this case, we're not even talking a landfall here in southwest Florida. It would still be quite a storm for us. You don't need a landfall to get a big impact from a hurricane. What the rain looks like in that model solution. And again, these are models. This isn't the forecast. This is what this individual run of this European forecast model is saying. A broad 6 to 8 inches of rain piling up along the coast here in southwest Florida, 4 to 8, even as you work all the way out towards Lake Okeechobee. The winds, we would likely avoid the major hurricane winds in southwest Florida if we do not get into the core. We'll discuss this in a minute here. And again, the worst winds in a hurricane are right around the eye, but there would still be hurricane force winds across much of the area, including 90-mile-per-hour wind gusts being put out there in Punta Gorda by this model. And there's your major hurricane winds going into Sarasota and Tampa. I think this is a point to make here, too. I'm seeing a lot of chatter about the fact that if this gets into the northern Gulf of Mexico, it's likely to weaken. It's going to feel some wind shear, some dry air is going to come into play. If this holds on the eastern side of the cone and makes landfall in and around the Tampa area, you see where the intensity is as a Category 3. I think we focus way too much on the category of hurricanes as they come in to the coast. But if this does come in more closely, we're talking a major hurricane landfall, not a weak Category 1 hurricane landfall. And even then, a Category 1 and a large storm is still going to be a huge impact with rain and storm surge in northern Florida. But we get back to the European forecast model, and for us here in southwest Florida, I sort of mentioned this yesterday. When we look at what would be the worst case scenario for storm surge here in southwest Florida, that worst case scenario, we always talk about it, would be a slow-moving major hurricane moving in near Sarasota or Bradenton, which is what the European forecast model shows. Now again, this is just a model. It's not a forecast. But if this were to play out, you can see why we're talking about dangerous storm surge by 3 o'clock on Wednesday, which, by the way, will be right around high tide. We would have significant onshore winds all up and down the coastline of southwest Florida. Storm surge is a combination of the very low pressure around a hurricane and the wide wind field taking the water from, in our case, the Gulf of Mexico and pushing it onshore. And you've likely seen the worst case scenario storm surge maps, which show parts of Lee County, Charlotte County, Collier County in the wrong situation, in the worst case scenario situation, 10 plus feet of storm surge. And in this scenario, that could play out. So it's something we'll be watching for. We are going to get some early forecasts, storm surge forecasts from the National Hurricane Center, I think as early as later on today, certainly by tomorrow. I do want to note, again, this is just a model, and at this point appears to be, this European forecast model, somewhat of an eastern outlier. As you look at the tropical models, the consensus right now takes this closer to the Big Bend, closer to the Panhandle, Apalachicola, perhaps even as far west as you see that green line, the American or GFS forecast model going in even west of Apalachicola. And when we talk about the structure of a hurricane, remember the worst winds are in that eye wall, a very thin band of very intense rain and wind that encirculates the cleared out eye of a major hurricane. So generally speaking, if you don't get into that eye wall, you're not going to see those major hurricane winds. The hurricane wind field, even with a major hurricane, usually extends only about 50, 70 miles out from the center. And in this case, the GFS forecast model shows a very, very different scenario than what I just took you through in the European forecast model. It has the center about 250 miles off to the west of Cape Coral as it moves off to the north going into Wednesday. This is Wednesday afternoon, just as, again, that European model has this coming onshore near Sarasota and Bradenton, 250 miles out, which would, of course, be a much lesser impact for Southwest Florida. We would still have tropical storm force winds, 40 plus miles per hour, especially along the coast. You could still see hurricane force gusts, I think, in a few cases. And there would still be a whole lot of rain. We're not going to avoid the rainfall from this. The moisture field around it is huge. Like I said, that front comes into play. We'd still be talking a broad 2 to 5 inches of rain across the area. We'd still likely be talking some flooding in pockets. We'd still be talking some coastal flooding at high tide. We'd still have that onshore wind. But overall, a path that goes into the central Gulf of Mexico, or at least further out into the Gulf of Mexico, would be a much lesser hit for us in Southwest Florida. I wish I could say we can lock onto this at this point in time, but unfortunately we cannot. There's still that uncertainty in the track, and we're going to have to continue to hone in on exactly where this is going to go and exactly what the severity of the impacts are going to be. I think the models are going to come in line over the next 24 hours, and we will know, we will have a much better idea. We already do, but we will have a much better idea of exactly where this is going to go in about 24 hours from now. So here are your takeaways. Ian will continue to gain strength today. I think that is locked in. This will be a major hurricane before long, if not in the next 36 hours, then in the next 48 hours. The models have shifted north for our purposes in Southwest Florida. The cone has shifted northward. Much of us are out of the cone. The chances for a direct landfall here in Southwest Florida now appear unlikely. The chances for major hurricane winds in Southwest Florida appear unlikely. But we are not out of the threat for impacts by a long shot. There will still be impacts here in the area, and there is still a decent chance we see significant impacts. This could still be a significant storm for us, and we're still watching, in particular, the potential for a dangerous storm surge. So, like I said, we're going to keep a very close eye on this. We will be tracking this storm for you around the clock. Be sure you're keeping tuned to every single advisory that comes out from the National Hurricane Center, that you have the latest data as you continue to make your preps for this potential storm, as you continue to make your decisions and put your hurricane plan into action in the coming days. We will have updates with every advisory on air here at ABC 7, and then Chief Meteorologist John Patrick, he'll be back tonight on ABC 7 News at 6:30 and 11 o'clock with the latest on Ian. Until tomorrow, I'm Meteorologist Jim Dickey. Have a good day.